Good morning, everyone. Now that we've had a very lighthearted conversation to start off the morning, we're going to, have a much more serious conversation now. For starters, I want you, Louise, to explain the iCivics curriculum. I think it's obviously the most prominent civics education source of education materials in this country. But maybe you can give us some context as far as what the civics education landscape looks like right now.
Great. So iCivics teaches about 7 million kids this year. So we teach more than half of the students in our country. And this is all over in all 50 states. And that is really kind of a very difficult task because in all 50 states, there are different standards and different things that students are learning. So a lot of people ask me, what are they learning? So they're learning about our Constitution, they're learning about our history, they're learning about the rules of how it works, and they're learning a little bit about their state, and they're sometimes doing service in the community. So that's basically what civics is. Over about many, many decades, we've seen a deterioration of how much civics there is taught and how in-depth it is being taught. And as a result, we've lost the capacity to do a whole lot more. We're really trying to change that. We have action in many states, particularly in Massachusetts recently, where we passed legislation to ensure that every student in Massachusetts will get a full grade 8 civics course and is required to do 2 projects, a civics project before they graduate from high school. So there are a lot of positive signs about how much more can happen. At iCivics, we use games and online games to engage students. So they decide the result of the next election by being the candidate for election. That is what creates the relevance for students. We are now in a digital democracy. Really important for us as adults to try to lay out a path for how to engage in a digital democracy.
And when was it that sort of civics education started to experience this downturn?
I think it was, if you look at the research, roughly during the years where we started as a population to have less trust in our government. So during the 60s, 70s, you could see a gradual deterioration of the amount and the depth and the importance of civic education. Sometimes you have a requirement on the books in some states, but nobody takes it seriously. It's not assessed. It's not provided resources. If you look at the total amount of what is being spent in civics compared to other disciplines, it's a rounding error.
Mm-hmm. And we were just talking, you said that the demand for iCivics has skyrocketed in the last year.
Exploding, I would say, yes. So the momentum for civics in general, the demand for iCivics itself, we're up 30% in many cases this year. So I would say that a classroom is just like what happens in real life, right? There is no difference. When kids see what they see in the political sphere, in the environment, on YouTube and wherever, they want to know about it, and they come in with those requirements and requests of their educators.
Right. So, Shelina, you actually developed a curriculum and have taught this curriculum that actually does bring civics to life for kids. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So, in my class, I try to give students a voice. I use advocacy in my classroom. For instance, with last year I had a student voice committee in my class as like a student governance opportunity, and during this time my students polled the staff and the students. I teach at the first African American high school in DC, and in America we started in 1870. We have a rich legacy of alumni and staff that paved the way for our students. But unfortunately, there's a disconnect. My students didn't know much about our legacy of the school. So one of the issues, which was a very top issue from last year, was that the students don't know the history. Not only the students, but the teachers as well. So we decided to come up with an Action Civics project to try to incorporate learning about history in our school. And fast forward to this month, now we have Dunbar History Month designated as November. So throughout this whole month at my school, we are celebrating and learning more about our history. from students, faculty, and staff. So just little things like that can actually make a difference in showing students that they can make a difference and their voice matters.
So often, civics and history are conflated or siloed, one or the other. They're not treated as complementary. How do you think schools should better navigate that dichotomy?
Just simply giving space to the students to discuss and talk. I've been in DC for 4 years now, and my first year here, my students said, I didn't think the principal would listen to what I had to say. Adults, we have to be more cognizant of making sure that we listen to our students, because if we don't, someone else will. So just giving them that space and opportunity, allowing them to let their voice be heard, and actually listening to them and not just giving them space, ear service or whatever, but actually letting them have a voice.
And the mock trials that you staged, those were another example of that? Could you tell us about that?
Yes. So our students learn about, I direct a law and public policy academy at Dunbar High School. And so we have lawyers and law students come to our school on a regular basis and discuss with our students what it's like to be in the courtroom, what it's like to have moot court mock trials. And so they actually go through this, and they're really enjoying it because it's hands-on. They're able to learn from professionals and then go out into the real world and actually showcase what they've learned.
Yeah. Jessica, you did something similar. I know you're no longer in schools, but you obviously have a lot of experience and can kind of look at it from a bird's eye view. Tell us about the curriculum that you developed.
Yeah, good morning. So I'll backtrack a little bit and say that I was in the classroom. I taught social studies and civics both in the Bronx and in Chicago. And it was the case of a lot of folks closing the door and doing what work we thought is good work that would be done, but fearing that a school district might not be excited about us talking about political issues of the day, right? And then the school district in Chicago in 2012 launched what they called the Global Citizenship Initiative, which was a pilot to allow, to start teaching civics as a course. Illinois was one of 10 states that didn't have a civics requirement. So I signed up to be one of those pilot teachers, and within a year I ended up going downtown and working with the task of trying to figure out how to build this pilot into a district-wide curriculum that could be accessible to teachers. And one of the lessons of that work was that we had wonderful curriculum that was out there and wonderful partners, but they weren't all pieced together in a way that made sense for teachers. And I think a lot of us, Shelina and I were talking about that, there's so many wonderful resources and you kind of have to pull them. And we thought for teachers who we were asking to teach a brand new course, we wanted to be able to give them some structure, but then some choice to respond to what their young people were interested in, the histories and issues of relevance in their communities. And so we created a curriculum that looked a little bit more like a Mad Lib than it did like a traditional scripted curriculum, where we said these are the kinds of activities and learning that should happen. These are the big questions we think are important to explore, and here are some resources for that, but you have to construct a curriculum that is responsive and relevant to the issues in the lives of the young people in front of you. And even in the city of Chicago, it's a giant city. There's a lot of diversity. There are a lot of communities with unique issues and histories, and so we wanted to give some flexibility for teachers to be responsive to that and craft curriculum with their students, with their communities. And so the curriculum that we created is called Participate, a civics curriculum for Chicago's youth, with the idea that we wanted it to not just be about federal issues and learning about the federal government, but we wanted to offer young people the opportunity to explore local Chicago history that's really important to them and to understand Chicago's role in the larger state. And it's not a perfect curriculum. We worked with teachers to craft this over time. It's now in a second iteration. And I think we've adopted, I'm no longer in the school district, but the district has adopted really an approach that says that this curriculum is the property of the teachers and students, and so we're going to collectively work to build that curriculum, and I think it's why it's had staying power. It's being used in over 90 of the high schools in the city. I think there's only 1 or 2 that haven't yet adopted it, and we've given the choice of schools to use it, but we're really proud of that. And the question that it asks students to interrogate is, what is my power in our democracy? How will I choose to use it? And I think that that's really the focus of, where we saw civics education needing to move, which is that young people need to understand what are the channels of power, but they also need to understand their place in it. And they need to practice and build those skills that'll let them do that, demystifying this thing that seems so far away and bringing it home and focusing on the issues that really matter to them.
One component that I find really compelling is the reparations curriculum. And could you tell us more about that and how it attests to that?
So in Chicago, there's a very infamous, terrible case of a history of torture by the police department and police commander and some of the people under his watch over decades, where they were torturing black men and taking false confessions and things and locking people up for a long time. And there was a sustained campaign by people in the city over many years to reveal that this was happening and to bring justice to the community. And eventually a reparations package was signed by the city council. And one of the things that the survivors felt was really important was, yes, monetary compensation, building of a memorial so that the city would never forget that this happened. But they said they wanted students to learn about this so it would never happen again. And so we worked with survivors, we worked with community advocates, and we built and teachers, the teachers union included, and we built a curriculum called Reparations 1, which sought to kind of uncover what was that history? How was that allowed to happen for so long? How were voices ignored that were saying this really terrible thing was happening in this city that we love? And so students explore that history, but then we ask them to think about what would it mean for our communities to thrive today, to have healthy relationships between police and the community. What are all the possible ways we might organize and build these relationships? And so young people get to think about different perspectives to that question and then come up with their own ideas about how to heal and move the city forward.
Got it. I want to get back. I want to definitely expand on the idea of really elevating kids' lived experiences in the curriculum. But before I get to that, Louise or any of you can answer this. One thing that I hear a lot when I interview teachers is just the difficulty of adopting a whole additional subject. There's that perception that this is something you tack on, that it's not something that you kind of weave in organically into the other subjects that teachers are teaching students. So Louise, what do you say when you hear that sort of concern?
Yeah, so actually that did not come up in Massachusetts when we passed legislation. Many other states have done the same. But it is a valid concern, right? If we treat schools as just a vessel on which we just impose more and more and more stuff without providing the resources, the training, and the environment for support for civics, it's not going to work. So we need to make sure that we allocate the resources and that we set up a situation so that schools can create civic learning plans. So a lot of what I think worked in Chicago or in Illinois is this idea of a school that is dedicated to the mission of generating and graduating citizens or civic participants in our civic life. You do that not only in civics class, right? So you do that throughout. So for example, civic skills, how to write a letter to your congressperson or your city councilor. That is something that you can teach in an English class, right? How to allocate a budget, something you can teach in a STEM class. How to be a responsible member of your school community. That is something that you can do throughout the school day and outside of the school day. So those are the kinds of attitudes that we're going to have to adopt inside school districts and schools to actually make this possible. And then you're also going to have to allocate budget.
At what age should we start teaching kids these skills?
So right now, I think most of the civic education is focused at middle school and high school. We need to start earlier. We need to start elementary. We need to be able to weave this throughout the entire schooling experience and then continue at the higher ed level, right? This should be thought through. These are, whether you're going to college or not, you're going to be a member of a community, and we have to recognize that that's important and that we have to live together and try to find a way to resolve what are now very complicated problems across a lot of differences.
Yeah. So back to the sort of cultural relevance of civics curriculum. is it different teaching civics to, say, a predominantly African-American school classroom versus a predominantly white classroom?
No, I don't think it is. When you're teaching, you always have to find the relevancy in what you're teaching to your group of students. So what I do may look slightly different in my classroom because of my population, but we're still doing the same thing. We're still having the same results. For example, going back to my student voice committees, one of the top issues at my school last year also was student behavior. We had students from all over the district come to my school, and there were difficulties because what happened in the community bled over into our school community. There were issues with that. So one of the suggestions from students was, well, instead of adults always deciding what will happen to us, whether we're going to be suspended or put in detention or whatever, why can't you allow us the opportunity? Sometimes when we speak to our friends, we can understand them better because we're the same age. We understand what they have to go through when they have to walk home every day, when they have to stay after school late because of certain situations in the community. All of that plays a role. And so now we have a peer court opportunity for my students. I'm training them so that they can actually see how can my friends repair the harm that they've done to the community. Sending me home is not going to help. What can we do here in the community to assist? Yeah. And so just things like that, I think, are very relevant, giving students advocacy skills to do that.
But that's not to say that race, ethnicity, gender, religion, socioeconomic class doesn't affect or have influence on what you're teaching or what you're emphasizing in the classroom, right?
It does.
Yeah,
it does.
Yeah. How does it affect it? Maybe Jessica, like you've done a lot in developing these sorts of focused curriculum.
Well, one thing I do want to say is that I hope we don't fall, though, into a thing where we think, well, only Black students or students of color should learn about race and racism, right? Like, I think that sometimes it's only, we only learn about some issues if it affects you. I think that as a country, it is baked into our history and it affects how politics work today. And so it is the responsibility of all of us to learn about that. And that means that teachers who teach in predominantly white communities need to get comfortable with how to talk about race with white students. But it also means that if we're dealing with, that we need to talk about issues of racism and anti-Blackness with Latino students, and we need to talk about issues of immigration with Black students, and we need to talk about indigenous sovereignty with white kids in Oklahoma. Wherever we are, we need to be always talking about these issues. There's not a, that this is this issue for this kind of student. Right. So I do want to make sure that we kind of hold that. And then the other thing I think is that this is hard, challenging work, right? It's really difficult, and these issues are so close and personal to people's lives and their lived experiences. So educators need support in how to do that, right? We need space to explore. We need policies that are permissive, that allow for teachers to do this kind of work, and that welcome them into that in a way that is healthy and supportive of the young people in front of us. And that's really hard. I would not, we spent years, we've been working at it for a long time, and I think it's incumbent upon us, though, to not pretend these issues don't exist, because they do, and if our schools ignore them, and if students walk in the door and are expected to forget everything they faced between when they left the door and getting to school, we are selling a false product, and it builds disinvestment of young people into what we're teaching because it's not believed that we really see and understand the issues affecting them.
Do you want to add something?
I want to connect that with something you asked about before. You asked about how to integrate history and civics, and Jessica's talking about this tension that we have with current events and how to tell those stories. The National Endowment for the Humanities and the Department of Education just awarded a grant to iCivics and Arizona State University, Harvard, and Tufts. That grant is to develop a roadmap to do exactly that, to integrate the gory and the glory of our country in a roadmap for how we should be teaching history and civics for the new demographic in our country, for today's really diverse learners, right? There is a shift in demographic in many of the large cities. We're majority minority. So that question is really urgent.
What is iCivics' guidance around navigating the political climate currently? Obviously, it's especially fraught right now, and teachers it's a really fine line between kind of engaging with it too much and not engaging with it enough. So
right. As Jessica said, this is hard, right? So I'm not going to give you an answer. What educators like about iCivics is that we start with the facts. So if an impeachment inquiry, for example, is happening now, we're going to teach about it, but we're going to teach about it from the facts. We're not going to teach about it from a polarized state, and we are going to provide educators support and guidance about how to do that. So that is where you start with those students, and then after that, you have to have the skills to be able to have a conversation with your students, which is where a lot of the learning happens across differences, right? Many of our classrooms are also polarized, and we have to recognize that all over the country. So we try to do those two things. We start with the facts, we anchor them in how to make that relevant to student, and then we provide support for educators.
One current event is the teachers' strike in Chicago, right? That just ended last week, and obviously there's been a wave of teacher strikes throughout the country. It's hard to ignore it, and the issues seem a lot more profound and sort of social justice minded. How are teachers navigating that in Chicago right now in their classrooms?
Well, Twitter is such an awesome tool because it gives you this lens into what people are thinking about. And a lot of teachers are on Twitter and sharing ideas. And right after the strike, teachers were talking about, how am I going to go in tomorrow and talk about this? How are my 5-year-olds that are going back to kindergarten, how are they going to be approached with this? And I think the discussion in the city was always around, like, what are the resources necessary for our schools to thrive? And what's so interesting about this kind of wave of teacher engagement is that it's not so much about the wages and salaries, although that is a relevant issue, particularly for school support staff who weren't making very much and whose children are in our school communities. But the issues are, what are the things students need? Social workers, counselors, librarians. These are like kind of things we think are essential to schools, and yet our schools didn't have. And I think that actually the CEO of the public schools and the union came out after and said this was a hard fight, but we all do want more for our schools, and we need a bigger pie to draw from to give the resources. And teachers went into classrooms asking, what do we need to thrive in this school? What are the resources that you need to learn? And asking those kinds of questions to get at this, are these polarizing? Politics is not neutral in that sense, right? Like, to learn politics, you're going to end up encountering political views. The question is, can we do it in a way that invites exploration and inquiry? Can we invite students to be the ones that imagine what is possible for them? And I think a lot of the teachers did go back to school and asking those questions. We were fighting for what we thought was best for our schools. What do you think is best for our schools?
And we'll end with a question from the audience. Is there a role for parents in civics in public school? So how can parents really participate in this process?
I'll give you a quick answer. They can advocate. We need civics in our schools in a very, very different way than it is taught now. It is a direct effect. If parents speak up and say they want it, it will occur. So that's number one. Number two is that they can participate with out-of-school experiences and help support what happens in service to your community outside of schools.
Yeah. What actually, yeah. Since you're on the ground and probably engaging with parents every day.
So ditto basically everything Louise said, just engaging in the school community, encouraging the students, and just discussing with the teacher. Connect with the teacher and find out what's going on, and involving your students in what's going on in real life.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much. That was an excellent conversation.
Thank you.